So, Qian Julie, where is your next in-person event going to be?
My next is actually going to be in Reno, Nevada. Yeah, I'm speaking to librarians. I've never been to Reno. I'm very excited. I didn't realize it was so far north. I was like looking at the map and I'm like, oh, it's actually closer to San Francisco than Vegas. So yeah. I love your color-coded books and shelves. That's very cool.
Thank you. They're getting a little out of color coding just because I'm getting so many books added that I'm trying to, at this point, find a spot for those books. And there's so many books I have by subject. I'm trying to figure out, okay, where are all my art books going to be? Do I need to separate them out? So I have to pull them all out and recolor code it, but you can still get the.
Yeah, no, I totally see. Yeah, if I had the minute I have more space, I will color code my books as well.
And where are you right now?
I'm in Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn, yeah. So space is an issue.
It's a real, the whole pandemic, it's been a real issue.
Okay, Grace, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Ed. And hello, everyone. Welcome to this evening's virtual book chat at University Bookstore, featuring author Qian Julie Wang in conversation with Dr. Connie So. They'll be discussing Qian Julie's new memoir, Beautiful Country. My name is Grace, and I'm the events producer here at University Bookstore in Seattle, Washington. Behind the scenes, handling Zoom tech and sending us all these great links periodically is Ed. Thank you for joining us today. We would love to hear where you're zooming in from, so please let us all know in the chat. And thank you for supporting this author event in a local indie bookstore. University Bookstore is the oldest independent bookstore in the region. In fact, we're celebrating our 121st anniversary this year. A few announcements before we start. This event is being recorded for later playback on our YouTube channel where you can watch it and send all your friends to. We'll be dropping the link for the books in the chat periodically, and you can purchase a copy with a signed book plate from us at any time. We thank you for your ongoing support. As a reminder, on Zoom webinar, you will be able to see and hear the author and moderator, but they will not be able to see or hear you. You may interact with them and other attendees using the chat field in your Zoom screens, and we encourage warm, supportive comments and sharing personal experiences. So please feel free to chat away. If you'd like to ask a question to be answered on screen, however, please put those in the Q&A field at the bottom of your Zoom screens at any time during their talk, and we'll get to them at the end. Beautiful Country is an incandescent memoir from an astonishing new talent. It puts readers in the shoes of an undocumented child living in poverty in the richest country in the world. And on a personal note, it is my staff favorite at University Bookstore. So I am so thrilled about working this event. This is actually my day off after like 5 days put in working a trade show, but I said I have to be at this event. So I hope you enjoy this book and this conversation as much as I know you will. Author Qian Julie Wang is a graduate of Yale Law School and Swarthmore College. Formerly a commercial litigator, she's now managing partner of Gottlieb and Wang, LLP, a firm dedicated to advocating for education and civil rights. Her writing has appeared in major publications, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and their 2 rescue dogs, Salty and Peppers, who made she showed us a picture on her phone. So hopefully she'll be able to do that for you all later too, because they're so adorable. Moderating the discussion for us today is Dr. Connie So from the University of Washington. Connie received BAs in English and Communications from UW Seattle, MPA from Princeton University, and PhD in Ethnic Studies, UC Berkeley. She's a professor of teaching at UW's American Ethnic Studies Department. She's active with Seattle's Asian American community and currently serves as president of OCA Asian Pacific Advocates, Greater Seattle. And now I will turn the stage over to Qian Julie and Connie.
Okay, thank you all of you for attending. And Qian Julie, I just want to say it's a pleasure to meet you. I really enjoy the book, and especially because I'm a Chinese immigrant from Hong Kong. And what I really liked about it is that you're giving light, you're addressing the stories of people who are oftentimes ignored, overshadowed, you know, and in this case, definitely in the shadows in the United States. And I also like the fact that you talk a lot about Chinese culture, even though China itself has some traumatic political changes in recent history. Nonetheless, a lot of people still have a lot of pride about being Chinese. So I thought that was really good how you're able to do the balance of this. Anyway, so again, I just want to thank you for writing this book. But to get started, especially because I want people, particularly those who have not read it yet, to understand what was the process that you went through in terms of what inspired you to want to write this book and the process you went through in putting down what you decided to tell. Because a lot of the stories, I mean, it involves so many people. There's so many secrets, so many things that a lot of us have been taught not to share about. And, you know, you bravely did share with an audience. So I'm wondering, can you go ahead and, you know, address some of these? Thank you.
Sure. And I just want to start off by thanking you, Dr. So, for moderating, spending time with me, and for University Bookstore and Grace, especially for your support, and all of the sponsors, and especially to the audience who are taking time, precious time out of their evenings to spend time with us here. Thank you all. It means the world for me to be here with you. I only wish that we could be in person together, but maybe one day soon. It took me a long time to find the courage to tell the story. In fact, for most of my life, for 20 some years, I kept everything that happened in these vital 5 years a complete secret. There were a few moments when I would even let myself think about what had happened, because there was so much messaging from my parents, from society, from politics, from watching the news, that what we had been or were was bad and dangerous. And if I were to share it at any point, it would call into question the legitimacy of my status, of my parents, of whether we were entitled still to be here now. And I think especially coupled with Chinese culture and its resistance to sharing, airing dirty laundry and all of that, it was a huge battle for me to overcome the tides that told me to keep quiet. The vital moment came when I became a US citizen in 2016. It was early May. It was 22 years after I first stepped foot in JFK Airport in 1994. And when I walked into the naturalization ceremony, there was a video of President Barack Obama greeting everybody in that room as a fellow American. And as he said those words, something profoundly shifted in me. And I didn't realize until that moment how badly I had needed to be recognized as American, and how no one would ever do that. No one would ever use that term on me, given my immigrant status, given how I looked, given the journey that my parents and I had traveled. And in that moment, I felt a newfound sense of privilege and power. I always thought, and by then I had been a lawyer for 4 years, I figured, I mean, I have a green card, I'm going to be a citizen, I'm a lawyer, I understand how it works. Being naturalized is not going to make a difference. It made a huge difference. Every day from that day on, I have never stopped feeling the sense of privilege. And with that privilege came for me a sense of duty and responsibility, especially going into the 2016 election and seeing the diatribe that was thrown at immigrants, and in particular, Chinese immigrants and undocumented immigrants. I realized that what I was doing at that point by continuing to stay quiet was making a deliberate choice, a choice that millions of people across America do not have. I was profoundly empowered and entitled to speak up. And yet, if I was still bullied into staying quiet, then what hope is there for anybody else out there who looked like me, who had been through some of the similar experiences that I had been through? And so I embarked on unpacking all of these years, all of the memories, went into therapy, which was earth-shattering and groundbreaking, and tried to really write and talk from the heart and pretend that no one was ever going to read it, because the minute I thought that someone might read it, that wall just came back up, and the messaging of you have to stay quiet, you have to not say anything, you have to not rock the boat, just became louder. And so what I hope to do by silencing those long heard voices is to give light to the beating heart behind the headlines and the political talking points and really humanize the experience of being a new immigrant. It's not that I thought that I could speak for all of us, because we all have very unique stories and we all have dimensions to us. But I really wanted to show, you know, that little girl out there who's still wandering the library, feeling lost and lonely and scared, that she's not alone and that there is hope.
Well, thank you for sharing that. You know, when you're talking about privilege, it actually made me think about childhood and that term childhood in itself. And I know this from, again, I'm a working class person, did not go through what you went through, because we were, you know, so-called registered aliens, as they have us say back then, right? But when it came to childhood, a lot of your story really resonated with me, because a number of things you have to do for your parents that many people don't think about. And again, when it comes to thinking about childhood, a lot of times, what does childhood actually mean, and when do people become the adult? Because a lot of times, for many immigrants, for many young people, the children immigrants, they're actually in many ways the inexperienced adult, because the people who are your parents, and this really changes what happens in traditional Chinese culture, or what happens in most families where parents are all knowing. But again, we've seen the young Grace wondering and questioning a lot of things, but not wanting to question her parents at the same time. So what would you say is a transition when, you know, you kind of dawn on you that your childhood is definitely not like what we see on TV, even though TV was a privilege for me as well. And at what point do you feel like you're actually more like an inexperienced adult? Was there any of those kind of thoughts going, or when did that transition come, or that awareness become?
You know, I've been getting a lot of comments since the book came out 4 weeks ago. Why didn't you write about your adulthood? Why did you only write about these 5 years? And my instinct was, I did write about I wrote about my early adulthood. The first sentence of my book is, I ascended to adulthood at cruising altitude. I became an adult long before I was aware of what adulthood was. And I think that's true for a lot of immigrants and a lot of children who have parents who are dealing with things, illnesses, addiction, whatever it may be. And so from the time that we boarded that plane and I realized I was not going to have my extended family around to help take care of my mother, who got very ill from motion sickness and always had, but up until that point, my grandma was there, my father was there, my aunt was there to help take care of her. I realized it was just the two of us, and I had a new responsibility to her. And for the first time on that flight, and especially upon disembarking, I saw my mother as a vulnerable human being. Before then, she was all powerful, all knowing, godlike. As long as my mother was there, everything was covered and I didn't need to worry. But on that plane, I realized I do need to worry. I have as much a duty to take care of her as she does me. And it seems like I now have some more power to take care of her. And that became all the more true during our early days in New York City, when I learned English much faster. I picked up on social mores faster. I realized that by virtue of what I chose to translate for her and what I omitted, I could keep things from her and therefore protect her in a lot of ways. And so I think for a lot of people who've been through this reversal early in life, they know that once that dynamic switch happens, it's very much impossible to go back to how things were, being an innocent child who just trusts that their parents will do everything. And that dynamic of me also parenting my mother while she was trying to parent me persisted for the rest of my life. I mean, it wasn't until I got to college and I looked around campus that I realized, oh, not everyone feels this responsibility. Like, I was calling my mom and speaking to her on the phone for an hour every day because I was worried about her. And I had taken on this role of being her little therapist and her best friend far too early. And because neither of us had anyone else, and it just became seeped into our dynamic. So it wasn't until I reached, I guess, physical age of adulthood, college and law school, that I learned, oh, this is maybe not the most natural way to engage with your mother now that you're an adult and you see that she's an adult, a fallible one. Both of us are fallible. And how do we map a new road forward? So, and part of writing this book and healing that, those traumas and wounds helped me with that, because I was able to simultaneously see what little Qian was going through and feeling and honor that, but also see what my mother had to carry, and as such, the limitations and strains that dynamic put on our relationship and how that has progressed even into adulthood. So I think immigration necessarily blurs boundaries within families because your unit becomes that much tighter and that much more insular. And these roles just becomes far more fluid than they otherwise would.
Yeah, and it also struck me while reading your book about the changes about your father. Your father began as somebody that was really admired, very knowing, to the person who really didn't figure out that the way to get some help was actually go to Canada. It was your mother who made the decision. And again, sharing these kinds of stories, I was thinking to myself, what would my parents do if I actually wrote something like this and, share some of the things that they had gone through? That's what I'm saying is very brave. And I, of course, as a college professor, I do probably share more stories about my family than I should. My kids always cringe when I do this. But I'm just wondering, at what point, or do you have the support of your family? And, it seemed like there was a lot of tension after a while between your parents. Was it resolved? Did it help the fact that you got things published? I mean, or did it get worse? I mean, how would you describe that? You said you had a lot of support from your family and friends, and you thanked a lot of people back in China too. So I'm just wondering if you can address that.
Yeah, I first want to touch on the point that you raised, which is that my father changed. And one thing that I wanted to really honor and give tribute to is the emasculation of Asian American men in American culture and what that does to immigrants, what that does to family. I have this line in the book. My father said he was a full man in China, and here he was just half a man. And I think it's really important to think about that because it changes how your father interacts with your mom and you as a daughter, especially, but even as a son, as any child. And I really did not appreciate that, the scope of that and the psychological effect of that within my father until recently in adulthood and understanding him and what he had gone through, who he was then and who he is now. It was very difficult for me to tell both my parents, but especially my father. I think in a way, my writing this book replicates the pattern that he lived and feared, which was his uncle or my uncle, his brother, writing a piece too openly criticizing the Chinese government and then resigning his whole family to being labeled traitors and dissidents during the Cultural Revolution. So my father at once had the dissident blood of speaking up, but also had this strong messaging, as I did, of being clamped down upon and being told to stay quiet because it's not safe, because it's dangerous. And so when I told him that I was going to publish this book, which I didn't work up the nerve to do until 6 months after the book deal was announced. My parents do not consume a lot of American media or go on websites. So it was easier for me to hide than the next author. But when I finally worked up the courage, it was like an act from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, where it was like a whole night of just unraveling and arguments and my husband trying to mediate between me and my parents. And what I realized in that conversation was more than the fear of ice breaking down our doors, which we all three still carry with us, was their overwhelming guilt and shame over my childhood. I think part of what made my father feel like less of a man was his inability to provide for the two women that he really loved and felt a duty to. And in their minds, the deprivations of my childhood were their fault, not society's fault, not a result of just the circumstances we found ourselves in. They blamed themselves and had been blaming themselves for 33 years. And so when I assured them that this book was coming from a place of love and understanding, they didn't fully trust it, but they could see how genuine I was. Still, I was scared to show them the book and waited until September 7th, the day the book became public, and I gave it to them. And I was terrified. And they said they didn't know if they could relive those years. They didn't know if they could read it. And I said, that's fine. I just wanted you to have a copy because the public has a copy. And they texted me a few hours later in the day and said that they could not put the book down. They were reading through their tears, and yet they were shocked that they felt healed by every page. And my mother especially was grateful that I had depicted not just her experiences in the sweatshop, but other people's experiences in the sweatshop. And they said that this book made those experiences worth it. And my wildest dream was for my parents to feel healed on some level, and for the three of us on some level to be able to put this behind us and to move forward and build a chapter that was untethered from everything we were not allowed to talk about. And I'm seeing that slowly happening. And my father, when the New York Times list was announced, my father said that there was nothing he was afraid of anymore. And in that moment, I realized that I was still very much that child looking for her father's permission to feel safe. And I finally got it at age 34.
No, actually, that's beautiful. I can certainly appreciate that. And, I also, a lot of it resonated because like my mom also worked in a sweatshop along with a lot of my aunts and many other, immigrant Cantonese. And so when you had this one passage about how you learn that there are people who are low income and there are people who are no income, I just thought that one really struck with me because I was thinking, we didn't say that back then, but we kind of were aware of that too, that there was a difference. But yet I thought even though there was no income, low income, and there were also some middle class Asian Americans, if everyone interacted very, very well overall, when you think about it. And I know in the book, you talk a lot about your affection for Chinatown, New York, and for Brooklyn, and for the United States. And a lot of people probably be surprised about that because at the same time, America hypocritically says a lot of very awful things, right? About undocumented people, about immigrants in general. I'm wondering if you can talk about why you decided to become a US citizen, especially since Canada, right, welcomed you. And again, there's a whole issue about, changing from one community to another. Because I'm also thinking about your father and your mother who are obviously proud about being Chinese, but at the same time, they left China. And I know when I visit China, we get questioned all the time why we left in the first place. So I'm wondering you can talk about some of that about nationality, loyalty, and just the communications we have within our immigrant communities.
That's a great question. I like to think of myself as being proud of being Chinese, but when it comes down to it, I don't really know China. I left too early to have a good understanding of China. I know it mostly now through the filtered lens of my parents and their memories and their recollections. What I know is being Chinese American or Chinese Canadian. In Canada, my family is just so grateful to Canada. They took us in when we had nowhere to go, and I had some of the best years of my childhood, my life there. But when we left for Canada, it felt very much like we were running away from something. We were being chased away, which was not the case when we came to America. We came to America as much to leave China because of my father's issues with the government, but as also for America. He was an English literature professor who learned about the United States through Dickens and Mark Twain and Ernest Hemingway. And to him, America was this beacon of democracy, of freedom of speech, of light. And yes, we do not always live up to that for sure. But I so badly wanted to prove my father right, that his sacrifices and his dreams meant something, that they were grounded in some form of reality, that when we left the United States for Canada, I thought from an early age, this can't be it. This can't be how my father's American dream, as it were, ends. This cannot be the end. I have to prove him right. And so despite my love for Canada, and I visit often, I think of it very much as a second home, I was determined to come back here. I was determined to live that out and prove my father right. And I felt very much New York. I think anyone who's lived in New York, well, some people hate New York City and some people love it. It's one or the other. But anyone who has lived here and loved it knows that it really gets in your bones. It gets into your fiber. You will always be a New Yorker. And I felt that. I am very proud of Toronto. I, again, consider it my second home, but I was first and foremost a New Yorker, and I had to come back and live out that happy ending that I saw modeled in Beijing or in New York, and live my own version of that.
Are your parents living in Canada now, or are they in the United States?
They
I'm
are
just curious.
back in the United States. They're in Jersey City. Yeah,
Oh, wow.
but we also, they talk about going back to Canada. There are times when they say, I don't know, like especially the previous 4 years. My parents say, why are we here? We should just go back to, I mean, Canada is not perfect. It's not, you know, heaven, and it has its own problems, but the problems that we, the Americans, were dealing with here during the Trump presidency were nothing like what we had seen in Canada. So yeah, I think they are of two minds, but again, my father's American dream holds strong, and I'm not sure I believe in it so much anymore. I think that we are called upon, the next generation, to build our own dream of what America could be and should be, and that's what I'm here to do.
You know, one thing I want to be sure to ask you about is because I have a lot of students over the years. I've been teaching for over 30 years, and I've always had a lot of undocumented colleagues, classmates, and nowadays students. And a lot of what you write about, for those who haven't had a chance to read it, you really should, because a lot of what you wrote about are actually similar types of details, similar types of, I want to go ahead and call it trauma for now, that many of my students go through. And one that always struck me from my good friends, who now is actually in a very high position in the Carnegie Institute, was how when people used to pick on him, he would never tell anyone. He would just go ahead and take getting abused. And after a while, people knew they get away with being abused like that. And many years later, I think it was like 3 years ago, I ran into him because I was working on with doing something with the Mellon Institute. And I ran into him and I said, I hope you're not letting people beat you up. He says, kind of hard. It became second nature for a very long time. He and I, we're both almost 60, right? And he said it's very hard to overcome all the secrets and the lies, even though he's a very successful person. So I want to ask you, on behalf of, I think, a lot of my students and friends and others, is especially when it comes to undocumented people, there seems to be a lot of generational weight, and I think you've addressed some of that already, that the students carry for their parents and for making their parents' dreams come true, and for not, looking down the parents, even though the society almost always teaches them to. Even when it came to the DACA program and Dreamers program, you almost had to come through and at the expense of your parents and everyone else. So I wonder if there's any advice you'd like to give this generation that's coming up behind you.
Oh, there's so much, and yet so little I can say. I mean, it's really true, and I'm glad you noted that, Connie, that DACA and Dreamers, when they apply for those benefits, number one consideration is, if I identify myself, what's going to happen to my parents? Mm-hmm. And that's not something that's ever talked about in all of the discourse that we see nationally, because people just don't know the real story and all the implications that come with having to maintain the secret for all of your life. So I think the number one piece of advice that I would give to Dreamers and the next generation is that it is not your fault. It is truly not your fault. And this is something that was very hard for me to believe. It was very hard for me to say. And once I said it, I still didn't believe it. And until you believe it and disown that shame that was born inside you, and I think this everyone can relate to, if you have a secret, and especially if you have a secret early in life, and is a secret that you are on duty to guard at the stake of your life, your family's lives, it becomes a source of shame. The fact that you have to maintain a secret necessarily ingrains in you this idea that who you are is not okay on some level. And when you grow up with that shame, and that shame grows within you and wraps itself around you, and it becomes part of your identity, it is really difficult to detach who you are from that messaging. That is not you. It is not about you at all. It is about the flaws and the imperfections and the serious inequalities in our legal system. That's and to be able to see those two separate things, it's kind of like how my parents saw their failure, it as being their failure in parenting versus a societal problem. And so I just want the next generation to know that it is not your fault. It's nothing uniquely wrong or bad or illegal about you. You have taken on the world on your tiny shoulders from too early. And it is also not your fault to continue to carry that burden. Your parents are adults who made choices, and I know that you love them and you feel obligation to them, as I do, but at some point, the final act of adulthood, and we all stepped into adulthood way too early and way too young, but the final act of being an adult that we have to complete, and that is a longer extended journey for undocumented immigrants, is being able to detach you and your life from your parents and your feeling of responsibility for them. And I'm not saying, just identify yourself as undocumented and get your family in trouble, but that guilt that we carry, that psychological burden that we carry, I think we all need permission to put down, if only just every once in a while. And that was what I needed really to write this book, because so long as I thought about taking care of my parents and protecting them, I was never going to move toward this dream of what I think America could be, or what message I would want to share with everyone else out there who is still grappling with these monumental issues and problems.
And thinking about that, I mean, I'm not as familiar with Canada's amnesty program. All I knew is from people I knew from Hong Kong who were trying to leave Hong Kong back because of 1997. And that Canada had a program where it's kind of a point system. You have this thing, that quality, that quality. Canada and Australia were willing to take certain people more if you're more educated and so forth. What are some other differences? I mean, that's the main thing I know about it, but were there other differences between Canadian refugee amnesty versus America's DACA dreamers and so forth?
The biggest thing I noticed showing up to Canada and adjusting to the fact that I had documents was that you need documents to get anywhere in Canada. You need a document to get into school. And this is actually a good thing about the United States, is that there was a vital Supreme Court case early on saying we're not going to ask for that, because what does that mean? That means that we are going to have a huge uneducated population that's not only dealing with poverty and immigration status, but now an inability to read and do math and do basic things. So that was one big difference I noticed. The other is the healthcare system in Canada saved my mother's life. We knew that she was going to continue to need healthcare, and there was no way, zero way we were going to be able to afford that, be able to brave going to the doctors and the hospitals regularly, given our problems with immigration. It's a big problem for the undocumented population in America, that people are scared to see doctors, so that these little health problems become major crises, and it ends up being a drain on the emergency care system at the end of the day, because they're still going to need healthcare at some point. It's just going to be a much bigger problem. And so when I got my COVID shot this March, and I showed up and they asked for ID, and I had my ID in hand. I knew they were going to ask for ID. And yet the minute they asked me for ID, I had this instinct to turn around and run. Me being a lawyer, being a citizen, being everything that I am, I still felt like I had to run. And that is a real problem, because it benefits everybody to get everyone vaccinated, to get the undocumented population vaccinated. The citizens benefit, the non-citizens benefit. It is just an all-around societal good. Why put these gates and barriers between that? And so I think what Canada has modeled on that front is a good system for us to move toward, hopefully sooner rather than later.
The other thing I was also noticing, I appreciate again in your book, is I know a lot of my students who are from mainland China who speak Mandarin. They oftentimes talk about how ill at ease they feel when they're going to predominantly Cantonese area that Chinatowns tend to be. In fact, Brooklyn also tends to be most people I know are Cantonese in Brooklyn. And yet you are living in an area with predominantly Puerto Rican community, within a Cantonese community, and in the United States, and then you go up to Canada. I always struck me that despite everything, your family, you have to be so adaptable in order to meet these types of challenges and be resilient at the same time, because again, as you're saying, you can't ask for this type of assistance that a lot of us in America take for granted. So I wonder you can talk more about the adaptability. But one word that actually struck me a lot, because we don't have this in Cantonese, but you used it quite a bit in the book, was I think I'm pronouncing it "be known." We don't really say that in Cantonese. We say like "ting hao, mo gao," things like that.
Okay.
So that was
Sounds better than what we say.
so I thought that's a very interesting choice of words and phrase. I understand what it means now, and I thought about it. I thought there's a lot of revealing of culture. And so much of that I think you can appreciate more if you actually speak the Chinese, Mandarin, Cantonese, whatever. But I also thought even if you didn't know, you kind of see what it is. It's a certain adaptability that your mother is teaching you.
Yeah.
Anyway, I wonder if you could just address we're both Chinese Americans, but yet there's still some super organic traits and values that a lot of us continue carrying on. Actually, I thought resonated throughout your whole book.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can talk about some of that.
Well, I think the idea of 吃苦, eating bitterness, is a
Right.
strong one in our culture. Something bitter comes your way, just swallow it and move on. And that was the mentality that my parents set for me and lived themselves. I saw them doing it. Who was I to not do it? Even though I had never tasted bitterness until I got here at age 7. But I think that's the magic of children and the resilience of childhood, is that kids just do whatever is in front of them. And there's almost no sense of temporality. It's just like, oh, this is what's happening now. Who knows what's going to happen in 5 years? I'm not even thinking that far. But I think it was also vital and a profound privilege that I had, that my parents were very educated before we were thrown into these circumstances. My father, again, had read books like Great Expectations, of someone digging their way out of poverty and making it to great heights. And so that was the messaging that I always got from my parents, both that it was temporary and we would make it out, but also that literacy and narrative were crucial. If I could speak English like a native speaker, if I could understand stories, if I could understand a way to tell other people's stories, my stories, receive other stories, then that would be a source of my salvation. And that really was why my father risked everything to come here, so we could speak freely and write freely about our stories, even though he then felt the danger of being aired out as being undocumented. And so I think the two things that really saved me were my strong and educated parents and books. Books were my salvation. They were my American family. They taught me the ways of America and showed me that despite everything that was wrong about me, my immigration status, being Chinese, looking different and being seen as different by white people, there was nothing that different about who I was and my dreams and my goals, because I was seeing in books these white and average, native average Americans who had the same desires and the same longings and the same plans for their future. And so it showed me, okay, people are telling me there's something wrong with me, but at bottom, we all seem to be human and not that different. And that was the dream upon which I built this book.
Yeah, I thought a lot of that was done so beautifully in this book. The other thing, I'm going to go back to what you said about your father and the changes he went through versus your mom. There were several passages where your mom got the job, and she switched career. And there was this white guy who was very, creepy in many ways, right? And I just thought at the same time, and I think a lot of people I know actually have gone through a similar experience. The guy is creepy, seems like a fetishist, but at the same time, he's one of the people willing to help out and do something. And I always wonder what your father must have thought, because he must have been able to see all that too. Well, it was pretty obvious to your mom and to her friends and everybody else. And even as a child, I recall some of this too when I was young. How do you make sense of that? Because this guy is kind of creepy, the fact that he's a fetishist, but at the same time, he offered an assistance and some privileges that he would, even going to McDonald's was a privilege, right? So that he introduced people to it. So I wonder if you can talk about this a little bit more.
I remind myself of this now in my adult life, because I still see this dynamic playing out of fetishists using their relative power to essentially prey on new immigrants, on especially Asian immigrant women. And I remind myself that it is a privilege to say no. It is a privilege to be able to say, I don't need your help. I can do it on my own. That's where my independence my independent streak comes from, part of it being dissident blood, but part of it just being having seen that for my mother, because she was so dignified, and she was at the forefront of developing computer science technology in China. She was published, she was respected and an academic. And we come here, not only is she engaging in physical labor, she has to endure this humiliation, really, in front of her husband, in front of her daughter, who she was trying to set an example for. And when I wrote those chapters, I mean, I cried through a lot of writing this, but especially those scenes, because what she gave up to make sure that I got a McDonald's meal that I longed for. Every kid, it seemed like every kid got McDonald's, and I was never able to get it. And finally, here was this creepy man making it available to us, but at what cost? At the cost of her self-respect, at the cost of her dignity. And that is, I think, the ultimate sacrifice, right? And I think my father saw it as well. But when you are desperate, you do not have the privilege sometimes to be proud, to say no. And now when I exercise that pride, when I exercise that self-respect and dignity, I remind myself that I'm able to do it because my parents went and acknowledged and accepted the removal of theirs for a time in my life.
Yeah, no, I thought those were very powerful chapters. And yeah, and again, thank you for your courage in writing about them. This is probably my last question I'm going to ask you, because I know 6:45 we're supposed to open up to the audience. But I know within a lot of immigrant communities, and probably a lot of people's communities in general, there are a lot of secrets. There are a lot of things we still can't write about. And also because of exposure, you don't want to expose other people who may not be able to come forth anymore. Not that we can't make you share those secrets. That's the reason why they're secrets. But what would you say generally are the type of stories that we really can't tell in a general sense? You don't have to go into detail or anything. What are some of the stories that we wish we could tell more people about in general, but we know that we can? And actually, you're writing about what happened to your mom. That was one that a lot of us really want to write about, talk about. And that's why I thought it was very brave, especially knowing that your mom might read this too. So.
Are you saying can't tell as in I don't recommend telling, or can't tell as in we don't feel comfortable? Or
we don't feel comfortable. It's gonna jeopardize other people. There's too many feelings. Again, that's why when you talked about your mother and that man, that was one of the stories it would have been hard for me to talk about. And that's why, seeing the challenge on that.
I felt a lot of strain and challenge in all the stereotypes that I wanted to rebut. And yet examples in my life kind of fed into, because American culture and Western culture so wants to flatten all of us into this one dimension, right? Asians are docile and quiet, and Asian women are attractive and sexually open, and Asians work in laundromats and sweatshops. These are things that overlapped with my experience, and I felt very much like, am I endangering our community by being honest about what happened, by being honest about my mother being fetishized? I really want to portray my mother as someone who is just asexual and very strong and manly and powerful, and yet that was her truth in parts of the story, but not her truth in other parts. And it was a huge struggle for me to resign myself to the truths. And the truth is that none of us are any of those things at all. None of us, I'm saying by us, I'm saying people are not any one thing at all times, right? We are all things at all times. And the only way to show that is to embrace the whole facet. So I wanted to show my mother as powerful and knowing and a professional and an academic, but also I had to honor the time when she had to give that up for the needs of her family. And it's incredibly painful. And whenever, as you say, Connie, it implicates our parents and others, it becomes that much more weighty. And when it came to confronting that decision and choice for me, I tend to be a very idealistic person, and I probably am more committed to principles than people. And my principle was that if this can help more people than it might hurt, then it is worth doing. I'm lucky to have loving and understanding parents who again recognize the power of books. And I had only hoped that they would see once this book came out that it was more than about us. It was about the community, the people out there who didn't have the choice of a voice. And because I had that faith, because they instilled that faith in me and I carried it forward, they are now seeing that. They see that it is not about them at all. It's not really about my family or me. And that's what I say when people ask, why do you focus on these 5 years? This memoir is not about me. It's not my autobiography. It's about the immigrant experience. It's about the resilience and strength of families. It's about honoring Chinese culture. It's about so many things that are universal and very much come to the core of what it means to be American, what it means to be human. And the last thing it is about my life and where I go from here. So that was my dream. And I think that people who are similarly torn, it might help to think about things that way, that you are contributing and giving out to the world, giving back to the world, some of the privilege that you have received.
Okay, thank you so much. And I hope you guys all read the book. It's a beautiful book. Thank you, Chen Julie. I would go ahead and turn to Grace because I know Grace is putting me on time. Okay.
Oh, we could go on forever. This is such an important conversation, and I feel honored that we're able to help bring this to people. So thank you again, Qian Julie. Thank you, Connie, for this wonderful moderated discussion. Let's move on to audience Q&A. Here's the first one. Not to minimize any trauma, because that is clearly real, but there is also potential in the early realization the adults are not gods. Many of the current challenges we face as a species originate in that false belief. How can such trauma teach us new perspectives that lead to better ways of living and thinking without perpetuating intergenerational trauma?
I love that question. That's a very smart question. My mother always says, I put so much on you in an early age. I should have protected you. I should have made you feel like I had everything covered. And to that, I say, one, first of all, that was not possible given what we were dealing with. And two, instead of protecting me, you gave me agency. You made me realize that I have power in me to shape the direction and the narrative of my life. And that is something that I continue to live every day. With generational trauma, if you don't think about it, or if you don't have to confront it early, you end up replicating the same patterns that were passed to you from your parents, which were passed from their parents, and over, and it drives everybody crazy. Everybody wants to break these patterns, and yet there seems to be no breaking out of it. What my mother gave me, what my parents gave me, and my childhood gave me was the knowledge that I could break the pattern. Whatever pattern we were living was temporary, and I had the power to reshape it. So when it came to writing this book, that was part of the fuel. I saw what happened, that my father, having grown up under persecution of government, had no choice but to replicate that dynamic and that pattern for me, because he just didn't have the mental health resources and the other resources to break that pattern. But I now had that choice and that privilege to turn around, stare at that passed down trauma for the first time in our lineage, and say, it stops with me. The buck stops here. I am not passing this down to my children. My children will get to create their own problems, whatever that might be, but it's not going to be the ones inherited from the Cultural Revolution. And so I think there is particular strength in breaking that godlike image early. And I understand exactly what you're getting at. It's a vital and pivotal point. Oh, you're muted.
Muted. Is it better now? You can hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. We have to have that at least one Zoom webinar. I'll be the person. So thank you for that question. Thank you for that very powerful answer. This is a question from an old friend of yours. So this is from Christina Park. Hi, Qian Julie, from your old friend, Christina P. I love your book so much. You are my hero. With a little heart emoji. I'm curious, what was the biggest surprise for you with the experience of bringing this book into the world?
Hi, Christina. Christina is a good friend from Yale. When a place where I felt very lost and very different and very lonely, and Christina was that kind and friendly face. And actually, that ties into what surprised me most, which was that I put this book out in the world, and I kept saying to my whole team, who had more faith than I did in the project, I said, nobody cares about a little Chinese girl. Nobody's going to care. Who's going to care about this? And the outpouring of love and support has just completely warmed over my cynical litigator heart. It's really shown me that we are more similar than we are different across races, across nationalities, across class. We all want the same things: love, belonging, meaning, community. And I wish I had known this in law school, because it's made me realize that also we all have these pivotal secrets that we center our identities around, and they become part of who we are. And then it becomes this barrier and wall between all intimacies that we try to build. And I very much had that wall up in my early 20s and for much of my life, until I could confront the things that made me human, but the things that I believed made me singularly bad, and the things that I thought I had to hide from everyone else, until I could confront that I was not ready to build that intimacy with anyone else, but was still lucky to find kind and generous friends like Christina, who helped welcome me into that world that seemed so terrifying.
Thank you. This question, the person who asked it said that you mostly answered it, but I am still going to ask it anyway, because I'm going to use it to jump off a little bit into another question. So this is from Isha. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I really resonate with the Asian and immigrant culture you mentioned, of hiding those shameful things and swallowing bitterness. And did you ever feel limited or feel the need to change the truth to protect your family during writing it? And I know you answered that just a little bit, but I'm also wondering from this question, now that the book's been out for a while and your family has had a chance to read it, and people you know have had a chance to read it, what is the feedback that you're getting? Were there things that you felt that particularly either resonated with them or they felt a little uncomfortable about? Was there anything that you either wish you could have done differently when you were writing it, or you know that you did the right thing in putting it in there?
I don't believe in going back and changing things, because in part because I'm such a perfectionist. If I had that option, I would change absolutely everything all the time. And so I just have to close that avenue off to myself. I had to, as I said, when in writing this, just pretend no one was ever going to read it, because otherwise there was no way I was going to ever finish this book. And then in the editing process, the only changes I made were deleting some scenes that I felt came a little too close to what my parents might be comfortable with having in the public sphere. Do I regret deleting those? Sometimes I think about it. Sometimes I wonder if it would have added to the book as an art form, as a creation, whether it would have resonated with people. But I think it was a lot for my family and for me to swallow, going from keeping all of the secret to being so out in the open, that I just don't think I can engage in that line of inquiry. What has shocked me is that I saw my parents as heroes and very much wanted to relay them as human heroes, real heroes, everyday heroes who have flaws and make mistakes, sometimes very bad mistakes, but heroes. And I just didn't anticipate how compassionate readers could be. They really got it. And my father did some not so understandable things until you understand and learn about his childhood, and then they make sense. And for a long time, I hated him because I didn't understand and I didn't know those stories. And I was so worried that readers would feel the same way. And yet I'm just so grateful that they have lived up to my faith. And if there's one thing that I've learned as a first-time author, is to always trust your readers. As a reader, I can feel it when an author trusts me. And so I wanted to engage in that leap of faith. And boy, have readers really carried that forward. So I am grateful.
Thank you. And I have a question. Well, she said it's more of a comment from Christina. And I have to kind of chuckle as I was reading this, because a lot of the things I'm hearing today really resonates with me, being a South Asian immigrant myself, and a lot of the things that people have been talking about their own parents and their own experiences. So here is this comment. As a third generation Chinese American who was lucky to have the privilege of childhood, I didn't have to be the inexperienced adult. But I have to laugh on page 173, spoiler alert, it is their job to tell me my flaws. If they didn't do it, who would? Everyone would lie to me out of politeness. And I'm like, I can resonate. I mean, this resonates with me as well. This is exactly what my mother, oh, the screen just flipped. Okay, this is exactly what my mother did to me. And I have carried on this Chinese trait with our daughter. Thank you so much for your book. I learned a lot about what immigrants of color illegals go through. As I was not able to discuss with my grandmother, who came over at the age of 21 for lack of language, more power to you as you go on to address these issues.
Thank you so much, Christina. I think we all cannot help but become our mothers, at least in some way. I don't have children yet, but I definitely have carried this on, even though I consciously work on not being nitpicky and not doing that. I do it with my husband. I do not do it with my dogs because they are perfect little baby angels, but it has to manifest somewhere. And I think the best thing we can do is just to be aware of it and to call ourselves out on it and not be defensive when others call us out on it, as they should, and to do better next time. So I think, we're all human, and again, like we mother the way we were mothered, and in some ways that's a blessing. In some ways that can be annoying.
Thank you. And that's one of the reasons that I find your book is so important, is because a lot of time as immigrants somewhere, we always feel like our experiences are isolated and unique and other people just don't get it. So hearing your experiences, seeing what you've gone through, and putting it out there in the world so that people will know that this is just an experience like any other experience. It just hasn't been written about for this community, before. So I thank you again for putting the book out. We actually have a few more questions. So is it okay if we go over a little bit?
Yeah.
Perfect.
So it's like it's 10 p.m. my time, and I'm a huge night owl, so I'm just waking up.
Good. And we'd hit it off because I'm a huge night owl myself. Okay. So this one's from Virginia. Can you talk a little bit more about limitation of mental health resources?
Well, I think mental health is just not discussed as part of a public health entity or problem, or in terms of resources. And that is a huge problem in America, and I think in many countries. But layered on top of that problem is the stigma in immigrant communities and communities of color of even seeking mental health. And it's a huge barrier, because communities of color are the ones who face the most psychological trauma, and we get re-traumatized every day we dare to go out in that white world. And as any amount of eroding that stigma that I can do will be my job to do out there, to speak publicly about going into therapy if you have the resources. If you don't have the resources, that's a societal problem. That's a community problem that we all need to get together and solve. We cannot use policing as a substitute for mental health. It is just not. We are tasking police forces to handle problems that is not in their purview and not in their training, and they're simply not equipped to do. What we need to do is divert funds from cops to social workers who are undervalued and overtasked with that job. And I think it's very important, especially I think within the Chinese community, but in Asian communities in general, to talk about mental health, make it visible. Because when I went into therapy, my parents thought I was crazy. They thought there was something vitally wrong with me. My mother tried to call my therapist and say, what is wrong with my daughter? What have I done wrong? And my therapist said, no, you've done everything right. That is why she is seeking help. We all need help. It is natural to want to talk about the things that had happened to us. It is not natural to expect everyone in our world, our coworkers, to listen. And it's you have to have boundaries. And so you need an outlet for figuring things out and understanding. And that's why I think the idea of narrative being powerful and important is a crucial one to set out there in the world, because what is therapy but the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves? And when we reshape those stories, we give people the tools to reshape those stories, we really can change lives. So I think this is a governmental duty to put more resources into. It is a community duty. It is a personal and individual duty to make this a visible and important need, especially among immigrants who not only carry their own direct trauma, but inherited trauma.
Thank you. I have two more questions. Thank you for writing about such an important topic. Undocumented Asians are such overlooked community, so thank you for bringing exposure to such an important topic. My question is, despite your experiences, do you ever feel truly American? As an Asian American myself, I often feel like we are born and raised here or recent arrivals. We're always denied the full extent and benefit of Americanness because we are stereotyped as perpetual foreigners. How do you feel about this?
You are absolutely right. We are always foreigners. We can have lived here for generations and we will still be identified as foreigners. I share a story in my book about being accused falsely of plagiarism because there's no way that a Chinese immigrant can write that well. That is not a story that ends in my childhood. I was accused of that at my law office 5 years after I graduated law school. I've been practicing as a lawyer for 5 years. My supervisor called me in and said, "This brief is remarkably well written. Where did you copy it from?" And this idea of no matter how credentialed we are, no matter how whitewashed we make ourselves look and sound, it's not enough. We will never be white. And it's important for us to understand that, because so often I think the system, whatever you want to call that, uses the model minority myth to clamp down on us and say, hey, if you behave, you're with us. Otherwise, you're out there. As long as they still have the power to say that, we are not accepted. We are not going to be included. So I don't know what it means to be American. I struggle a lot with that. I criticize America a lot because I love it, because it is my home. But there's a lot of America I don't understand. I do, however, feel like a true New Yorker. And that is a place that has given me home. When I am in New York and on the street, there's so much diversity. And Seattle too. I mean, there are a lot of pockets of America where I feel like, okay, this is my place. These are my people. And that's important. Everybody needs that. And I am fortunate to have found it in New York and in the time that I've lived on the West Coast. And I'm just grateful. I mean, being in a big city has afforded me the privileges and benefits that I would not have had as a minority, as an Asian American, as an immigrant, that I would have had in some other parts. So yeah, I am there with you. I think it is a problem and a challenge that we all, this next generation, needs to take together to tackle. And I'm seeing a huge growth in the passion and the voice of young AAPIs across the nation, especially on the heels of the Atlanta shooting. So I am hopeful that we will carry this momentum forward.
Thank you. And this one is similar. How much pressure would you say is placed on children of immigrants to live out the American dream that our parents wanted for us?
Oh, universes of pressure that no human being should have to live under. Our parents gave up a lot. They gave up their youth, in some cases their childhood, in some cases their teenage years. And so much of that need to relive or live the childhood or the life that they wanted is then placed on us. That was why I was insistent that I had to write this book and get this book out in the world before I even thought about having children, because I could so see myself just dragging my poor kid everywhere, making her do the things that I wanted to do and never got the chance to do, and just living through her. And that's such a human tendency, isn't it? So I don't blame any of our parents for wanting that, for putting that onto us. At the same time, given everything that their sacrifices in turn traded in our lives, we now have the power and the ability to say, no, that is not mine. That is yours. You actually brought us here so that I could live the dream and life that I wanted. You simply cannot understand what it is that I want because you are you and I am me. And that can be very hard to separate for Chinese parents and for immigrant parents. So I think that is our burden and responsibility to delineate those lines and build those boundaries. And I know that it can take many decades to do so, but I think it is a worthwhile task.
Thank you. And this final question, I promise, but I have to ask it because I asked you this when we met during that pre-pub event for your book. And I feel like this is going to resonate, especially with our audience too today, is a question of choosing your name and identity. And I also have, I have a Christian name and I also have a Sanskrit name. And all my life, it's been kind of living between both. You know, my family, my parents, everyone, depends on how you know me, you call me one thing. And then when I go to school and people will not even try to pronounce, you know, my Indian names, then I go by Grace.
Yeah.
But now they're both a part of me, completely a part of me. And you have that experiences, and you've chosen to do something with your name and how you choose to be addressed and how you have claimed your identity. And I would love it if you quickly shared that with our audience today.
So those who read my book know that I was born as Qian and was Qian for most of my childhood before early puberty. Then I moved to Canada and I was like, oh, this is my time to fit in, to be normal, whatever that was, to be easy, to just try to be as white as possible. So I chose Julie. And that name stuck with me pretty much until last year. And Julie never seemed like it was my name. It just felt like, oh, this is what I'm going to give you, white teacher, so you don't have to struggle and fumble with my actual name. This is my alias, my cloak, my invisibility cloak to fit in and make it easier for everyone. And I actually went by Julie Wang, which is not how you pronounce my last name. It's Wang in Chinese, but I just went by that because it was easy and everybody knew what it was and wouldn't misspell it. Then when I wrote this book, I was like, well, I can't call her Julie. She's Qian. She was Qian then. And upon publishing this book, my team said, well, how do you want us to go out with marketing you as an adult now? Do you want to be Qian or Julie? And that question just put me in this bind. It was like a doctor asking me, do you want to amputate your right leg or your left leg? Which is it? Because by that point, Julie had become a part of me, and I had given her meaning because I had used her to stand up in the courtroom time and again and represent not just myself, but my clients, some of whom were immigrants and children. And I had given her that meaning of that, poised, loud adult, as opposed to Qian, who was a scared but also vivacious child. And I thought, man, if I could keep both, that would be great. But my whole life, I've been asked, are you Chinese or American? Are you Chinese or Canadian? Are you Qian or Julie? It's always been, and how we frame questions, people who are parents know, how we frame questions is the premise upon which our lives are built. And I reject the premise of that question. I am both, and I cannot choose between Qian and Julie. And so I decided to take up space and be annoying and have people learn how to pronounce my name and understand it is a two-part name, because I am equal parts Chinese, equal parts American and Canadian, equal parts child and adult. And so I hope that it also gives others permission to feel and live in that duality, because we are so conditioned and trained to code switching and dividing ourselves into halves, and we can be ourselves at all times. I hope that is the dream.
Thank you. So thank you to author Qian Julie Wang and to Dr. Connie So for wonderful and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you for these important organizations who help support this event: Organization of Chinese Americans in Greater Seattle, Northwest Asian Weekly, the UW Women's Center, and the Chinese American Citizen Alliance. Connie, there were many. Did I leave anyone off? Okay, please.
Department of American Ethnic Studies.
Yes. Thank you. And thank you to you, our audience, for joining us and helping support these community spaces for sharing and promoting the love of literature. You may purchase copies of Beautiful Country using the links in the chat, and those purchased through the university bookstore will contain a signed bookplate. Thank you again for spending this time with us, and we hope to see you at another one of our events soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.